JJWalsh in Hiroshima, Japan. And today I get the pleasure of catching up with the amazing Winifred Bird, talking again about her book, which everybody should read, Eating Wild Japan, talking about food foraging. And we're going to continue the conversation that we started a year ago. I'm so excited to have you again. Thank you so much, Winifred.
Yeah, thank you for having me back.
It's great to connect again. And of course, we have time differences. You're in the US now. You said you just moved to a new rural island community in Washington Island. Have you been able to
Yeah.
find any local foods to forage there?
Yes, of course, everywhere. I mean, the wild edible plants are everywhere, but this is a great place for foraging. It's Washington Island is an island in Lake Michigan off of the tip of the Door Peninsula in Wisconsin. So it's the 45th parallel. So that's like about the same as the far northern tip of Hokkaido. So it's like a very northern climate. It's like a little bit different than I'm used to, having grown up in California and lived in Japan and all over the place. But yeah, so there's like all the familiar kind of weedy plants that you find all over the world, including in Japan, like dandelions and let's see, what are some other ones? I have a list here because I was trying to rack my brain. What are what are all of them?
You said you could
You
find
have
some fiddleback or
fiddleheads, yeah.
fiddlehead.
So fiddleheads, right, can refer to like the different kinds of ferns. The shoots that come up, they're kind of curled like the end of a violin. So we do have Warabi, which I write about in one of the chapters in the book. They're called bracken, and oh, there's a picture. Yeah, they're called bracken in English. Um, and they, as I mentioned in the book, they pretty much grow everywhere around the entire world. They can survive in like every single climate, basically. And they grow here. They're pretty scrawny here, which is interesting. The soil here on this island tends to be pretty thin and poor and sometimes sandy. So one place where I found them growing like abundantly is a very sandy. It's called almost like a sand pit. Like we take the kids there to like a giant sandbox. It's like a natural sand area, and it has a lot of warabi growing there. And I picked some this spring, and they're very thin and not very juicy, and so it was interesting. It's kind of like this familiar plant, but yet different, and not as appealing as maybe in Iwate Prefecture in
Yeah,
northern Japan.
but I heard that in one of your interviews that you did since we had the chance to talk last March. I think it was with the group for translators, Sweat, and one of the Japanese Americans in the audience was saying she's lived in America for many years. Sometimes she misses SANSAI, she misses the foraged plants, and she finds them in America. But she talks about how different they taste, and this is something that you said, even in Japan, in different parts of Japan, the wild forage foods can often taste really different, right?
Yeah, it varies hugely, like from location to location. Like we moved here to Wisconsin from Illinois, and which is only one state away. And plants that I would forage in Illinois, and that would be wonderful. I'll find them growing here, like say Juneberries and mulberries. Mulberries are a plant that grows all over Japan because the silkworms used to be raised on mulberry leaves, so now they're all over the place. And anyway, you can eat the berries, and we just used to love going mulberry picking in Illinois. And so we came up here and like we learned that it's a further north. The climate is more of a northern climate, and they just don't like there's some trees, but they just don't really get many berries. And it's just not a staple forage food like it was down there. But on the other hand, we have like tons of maple trees, and maple syrup making is a really important part of the culture here. It was an important part of the native culture before European settlers came in, and it continues to be an important part of the diet for the people who live here now. as well as plants like ramps, which are very similar to Gyojin and Niku. Sometimes they're called wild leeks. They're very abundant here. So it's interesting when you move to a new place, like I find I'm attached to certain plants from the place where I came from, and I have to relearn, like, okay, I'm not going to be able to eat those anymore, but you have to shift to what is locally abundant and kind of like it's almost like you're becoming a part of the new environment and ecosystem that you are moving into and adapting your own diet and your own like kind of almost like tastes and preferences to that place. So it's an interesting process.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that since we talked last year, your book and the topics from your book and our conversation have been coming back to me over and over again when I talk to different guests, when I travel to different places. I'm always making connections with what you have introduced in your book, and I just love it. So, you talk about so many varied subjects, but I love this idea that you said in one of the interviews recently, that whenever you wander, you look at a landscape and think, "What can I eat?"
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And right. And when I move, I mean, I've moved so many times in my life. A big part of that moving process is right, like looking around and saying, learning the plants, learning, oh, okay, I recognize these ones. I don't recognize these ones. Talking to people about the plants here and what do they use. So for me, that's like a really important part of becoming comfortable in a new place and feeling like I'm part of it. And it's a long process, it's kind of happens over the seasons. And like I moved here last summer and I'm still learning, okay, what are the seasons here? How do the plants kind of, what are their cycles over the year? So I'm sure it will take years, I'm sure, to really learn that.
One thing that has come up over and over in our talk and then in many of your other talks, you often bring up this fascination that you've developed over your years of research between how humans and nature interplay. How, because of foraging, the forests have been created around areas where people live in a certain way. Certain trees have been favored, certain plants have been favored, and even though we don't have food foraging culture so deeply, even in Japan, that's still a lasting legacy
Yeah.
of this food foraging history in Japan and around the world, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. So it's interesting, if you come into a rural area, say from the city, not knowing anything about its history, you might assume that you're looking at a quote unquote wild forest or a wilderness. Say you're in Japan and you're just outside a village and you see a beautiful little deciduous forest with some flowers growing under the trees, and you think, oh, what a beautiful piece of wilderness. Well, the fact is that is probably a remnant of Satoyama, which is the village woodland that has been tended and created, kind of like co-created with nature and humans over really centuries, and kind of shaped to have more plants that are useful for humans, but also still be a kind of a wild place that is really abundant in plants and animals and insects as well. So, right, the same is true in the United States. Only now are ecologists and historians learning that what Europeans came in and viewed as an unbroken wilderness was in fact very much shaped by the humans who had been there for thousands of years, say burning grasslands to keep them open so that they could harvest wild grains, and so that there would be, abundant birds, shaping it in a certain way that, say, deer and birds um, like and will multiply, and so they have something to hunt. So I think all over the world you find they're often called in Japanese like semi-natural um, landscapes, like Satoyama, the equivalent of Satoyama. And right, I think it's important to recognize that, and to recognize that people can be part of the landscape, and in a positive way, not necessarily that human influence doesn't necessarily have to mean a decline in abundance or a decline in biodiversity. It can be a positive relationship that is sustained over hundreds or even thousands of years.
Yeah. Wow, it's so interesting. And so it's so key to also a lot of the work that I do in tourism. And I see Paul has mentioned here, he recently dipped into your book when he was investigating Uesugi Yozan's katemono in Yonezawa as part of his
Uh-huh.
tourism consulting. So
Oh,
interesting.
okay. Yeah, cool. Yeah, that came up in the chapter. Let's see, it was the chapter set in Iwate about Warabi and the use of the bracken rhizomes during famines. And the Katemono book is kind of like this historic book about edible wild plants, specifically that can be used during famine times. Um, you know, to get people through the times when agriculture is not producing. So that's great to hear that
Yeah.
was
Really
useful.
interesting. And that was part of the things that when I was refreshing and listening to what we talked about last year and then reading the book again, and part of the thing that I really picked up on this time is the fleeting nature of a lot of the sansai that you talk about.
Hmm.
There's a certain calendar different from the Western calendar. There's 72 weeks it's separated into, and it's like an Asian adapted from China to Japan, and it's done weekly, and there's certain weeks that say now is the time when the bamboo shoots are shooting up or the peach blossoms are coming out. And it really made me question, is this changing, like this specific week by week, is this changing because of climate change? It must be, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And gosh, I wish I could remember when I was first in Japan. I did a story, one of the first journalism stories I did about a Ministry of Environment project to um, kind of that project maybe got its inspiration from those very detailed seasonal calendars, and it was like a citizen science project to have people track these very subtle seasonal changes and try to see if they were changing because of climate change, and they are. I mean, so it's actually really valuable to have those old seasonal almanacs and records. And I remember also hearing that some of like these seasonal diaries kept by like country gentlewomen in England are now becoming references for comparing how are the seasons changing because of climate change. You know, the sad that some of the it's like a very ants, and like some of the pieces don't fit together anymore. So maybe a certain insect depends on a certain blossom or a certain plant being there in this place at this time, and now it's the timing is off and there's not enough to eat. So because it's changing so quickly, not all the plants and animals can adapt fast enough to make everything work. So you have some of these really sad kind of stories going on.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, but it's like you said, it's an important reference tool to really see how climate change is changing. We hear about farmers having to update when they plant now earlier in the season, later in the season. In some ways, good because they have longer growing season, and in other areas of Japan and the world, much shorter growing season. So it's really
Yeah.
area by area is affected so differently. Now,
Yeah.
connected to this is, even though it's fleeting, you were saying, of course, there's many different parts of the same wild plant which can be harvested at different times for different purposes. And the whole practice of foraging for wild plants means that the people's diet is more diverse. And I thought that was really interesting. And they have to have a deeper knowledge of a bigger area, which also should be diverse, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because in a culture or a diet that is based on foraging, the food security comes from that diversity, because you don't have a huge amount of any one thing that you can harvest all at one time and just put away. You depend on little bits from many different plants coming, getting ready to harvest all throughout the year, and not just many different plants, but many different types of habitats. So, you know, um, your swampy area is going to have different kinds of plants than your drier edges, and your forest versus your edge of the forest versus your open meadow. Those are all going to offer more different kinds of plants and more food security, because not only can you have a succession of foods over the seasons, but you're also able, um, if one of them fails, you have backup. You have multiple backups. So right, I think there is a connection between how you eat, whether how dependent you are on agriculture versus foraging, and how much you value, in a very real and kind of immediate sense, you value that diversity in the landscape and in the plants.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's not just kind of like an abstract valuing. It's like, it's a very much, when it's part of your food and part of your diet. Even today, even if it's just a hobby, or just one part of your diet, you really like feel it in a more direct way than if it's just kind of this abstract thing, like, oh, we know diversity is supposed to be important. At least for me, it feels more immediate when I have it as part of my diet and my lifestyle, kind of.
Yeah. One of the aspects of diversity last time, one of the stories that I often tell other people from our conversation was your 10-course meal in Kyoto with the bamboo. And that's just incredible that you have bamboo mousse, bamboo sashimi, bamboo everything, right? Amazing. But the fact that you also visited Akita and you
Mm-hmm.
went with a farmer and he showed you at 5 a.m. This beautiful area that he found a special kind of bamboo and he roasted it on a little barbecue. And you guys had an amazing breakfast together. I love that story.
Yeah, that was probably like one of the best meals. It was like one of the simplest, it was just that freshly picked princess bamboo, or nemagari dake. Yeah, and there's a picture of him picking it in the forest that morning. Right, so we got up at like 4:30 or something, which is the time he said he usually goes out to the forest before work and before it starts to get hot. Um, and it's dawn, and it's just beautiful to be out in the forest at that time, and to be picking these fresh bamboo shoots, and they're very slender and kind of delicate. um, and then we brought them back to the guest house where I was staying, and he made a little charcoal fire in the irori, and just roasted them there, kind of in their those kind of papery sheath that they have around them, right over the charcoal, and just ate them with a little bit of salt, sitting around the irori, and it was just like, um, yeah, some meals, it's like it's delicious, but it's also so much more about the whole experience, and just feeling a part, to be a part of that place, and a part of that little community, even if it's a kind of a temporary community. um, but eating together around the fire, it's just a very like elemental thing, and it made the food taste pretty amazing.
Yeah. And in one of your recent interviews, you were talking about this area, like so many areas of Japan, is having a declining population, aging population. There's a lot of people who used to know the food foraging culture, which is now decreasing. There's less people aware of the food foraging opportunities around the area, as well as the history and culture, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I think there's a resurgence of interest in wild foods, at SANSAI in Japan and foraging in the United States. Certainly, it's kind of a hip. A lot of young people are interested in it, are learning about it. But I think that definitely the number of people who have that real deep knowledge that comes from it not just being a hobby or an interest, but it being a real part of their lives. And people who live in these, say in Japan, live in these mountain villages and have been foraging their whole lives. And not only them, but it goes back generation upon generation of knowledge, very specific to one local place. What grows where? When is it ready? How much can we take without depleting the resource? How do we prepare it? What are the local ways of preparing these foods? These very specific kinds of knowledge just are disappearing in a lot of places, and we're preserving like kind of pieces of that and kind of general knowledge about the plants. There's plenty of books, there's plenty of internet resources. You can find the basics, you can find all the general knowledge, but you can't. What we're losing is that very place-based specific knowledge and experience and culture, the culture of just having it as part of your life on a daily basis. And yeah, it's sad, and it's part of a much broader changes that are happening in society. So in order to fix it, you can kind of say, yeah, let's learn about Sansai. Let's have city people come out to visit the country for a few days. Well, that's good, but it gets at the issue on a surface level. I think that
You
yeah.
need to engage more with the people there, that add it maybe to part of their daily lifestyle more than just an occasional visit. But that is some way that you could use tourism. So if you have a local guest house, the local guest house staff become aware of Sansai. They're more aware of where it is and educated to do tours. They might incorporate it in a part of their lives if they use it as a part of the tourism experience, right? So that's another wrinkle that has possibilities, I think.
Right. And also it provides a source of income that allows people to stay in some of these more remote places, which is really important. Just a way to, like, lots of people want to be there if they can find a way to make it work. So that's
Yeah,
another
definitely.
important
Let's
thing.
just step back a little bit and talk about where you were. So you were in Matsumoto in Nagano, is that right?
Yeah, and that's where I was living in the last few years when I was in Japan. Yeah.
And I saw this on one of your slideshows. So you were actually growing organic rice. You had ducks in your rice field. So
Yeah.
that's a good way to know it's organic when you see the ducks. I love that.
Yeah.
And quite a cold old house, but very beautiful. I love seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was a wonderful experience. I feel lucky to have lived there for a few years. Yeah, like you said, having ducks, it's a good way to know it's organic. I remember we would come to our field in the beginning of the year, um, before the ducks were in, and there would just be all kinds of little insects and frogs and stuff. And then, sadly enough, we would put our ducks in, and they would just have a bonanza eating little frogs and insects, which the insects, we were hoping they would eat the insects to control them. But yeah, by the time they started growing, the ducks started growing. There weren't too many frogs left in our field. I'm sorry to say, but it was a great way of doing
But
nomads.
that kind of connects to your work when you went and you did research with the Ainu. communities in Hokkaido. This is how nature is supposed to work. Animals are not supposed to eat everything to eradication. Animals in nature are supposed to know more naturally how to live in balance. And it sounds like you found that with indigenous cultures as well, in Hokkaido with the Ainu, that they had a very different idea about foraging for food, and the ways that they prepared the SANSAI was also different. I found that really interesting.
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, to your point of um, using the plants in a way that was sustainable over generations. The community I visited in Nibutani, which is where a lot of Ainu people live in that part of Hokkaido, and they have a lot of like cultural kind of revival activities going on, and a real strong, uh, yeah, a real strong community. So right, the woman I met with, a few Ainu women who have been studying their own food culture and documenting their own food culture, kind of talking to the older people in their community about what they would harvest, how they would prepare it. They put together a cookbook of traditional Ainu recipes, and also oral history stories about all the different plants and harvesting practices. And they told me that there were very well established ways of making sure that the resources were not over harvested. For example, um, different families would rotate through using different areas for foraging. So I would imagine it was kind of like a commons. I'm not sure exactly the arrangement, but I remember them saying that, right, so this family would harvest here this year and here this year. So you always knew that you were going to be harvesting on somebody else's spot and they were going to be harvesting on yours in the future. So, you kind of knew you had to take care of it and they'll take care of it. And you also knew that not everybody was going to the same place to harvest the plants, because that can be a problem with over harvesting of some of these wild plants. Some of them are sensitive to over harvesting, and some of them are not, but some of them take a long time to regenerate. So now we don't have a very organized system for deciding who goes where and takes what. It's more like a free for all, a bit more chaotic. So there's a lot more risk of depleting the resources. Whereas back when the Ainu people in that area were really depending on those wild foods for their livelihood and to survive, they had a really well established way of managing the resources to make sure that they stayed sustainable over the long term. Uh-oh.
That's can you see and hear okay?
I can hear you. You're frozen on my screen. Can you see
It
and
looks
hear?
okay. It looks okay on my side. Yeah. I hope it
Okay.
gets better.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was another thing that you talked about in a great interview you did with Brigitte Jackson Buckley. You were talking
Oh yeah,
more
she's
about the
great.
community aspect of it and the stigma as well, which I had never come across that part in the book or realized. But there were certain foods that the Ainu were foraging and using as a part of their diet. But once they, for example, had to go and integrate into schools with other Japanese kids or into workplaces with other Japanese people, they stopped eating it because it had like a garlic fragrance, or they didn't want to
Mm-hmm.
have that stigma. So that
Right.
changed their foraging culture. I'd never heard
Yeah.
that before, but you can totally
Yeah.
understand how that social pressure would also change
Yeah.
foraging culture, right?
Yeah. No, it's really sad. I mean, that foraging became a foraged foods, certain foraged foods became a symbol of like barbaric society, pre-agriculture, and agricultural society was seen as superior or more advanced. So the foods became associated with that, and people wanted to dissociate themselves from them, or were forced to, because you know that was not valued in the culture that they were forced to become a part of or that assimilate into. Um, so, right, they said they were talking about Gyoja Ninniku in particular, which I mentioned earlier tonight. Ramps, or is a very similar plant, wild leeks, wild garlic. Um, they have these kind of deep green oval leaves that have a really pungent smell to them. They're delicious, but especially if you eat them raw, it's like eating a clove of garlic. Um, so, right, people stopped. It's a really important food in Hokkaido, in northern climates, just like it is here in Wisconsin, similar climate. Um, and people stopped eating them because of that stigma. And now that's changed, thankfully, and it's reversed to the point where people are coming into Nibutani and these areas to harvest, to take the traditional Ainu foods, because there's this growing interest in it, and it's actually becoming a problem. That there's some overharvest going on and stuff like that. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
you
think that,
you touch on that a few times in the book and in many of your interviews, how what is our human connection to nature? And of course, this is a much bigger issue, many issues beyond wild foods in the forest and foraging, but the exploitative idea, right? Taking more than you need just because you can from
mhm.
nature, from foods, from animals as well, which is so unnatural. It's not the way nature balances itself. Such an important
Yeah.
issue that you have in your book so many times.
Yeah, and it's such a hard question. Like, what is enough? How do we recalibrate our sense of what is enough, now that we've been living so beyond, the carrying capacity of the places that we live in, and of the entire planet? Um, Obviously, we can't go on like this if everybody is living in the way that, say, Americans have been living for the past 100 years or 50 years, or our levels of consumption. So we have to kind of readjust. Okay, what is enough? How can we only take what we need? Yeah, and I think I do feel that one of the things that I reflected on when I was writing the book, and thinking about SANSAI in Japanese culture, was that communities that are very connected to a specific place, that have been there for generations and generations, just as a practical matter, learn ways to stay within what that area can provide, because for obvious reasons, if you take too much, you are undermining your own um, ability to live there. So, for example, cut down all the trees. There's none left for next year, the year after, your children's generation. Um, and now we're able to draw on resources from the entire globe. So we have to kind of learn that lesson in other ways. Learn how to only take enough, in a more kind of abstract or intellectual way, and it's hard. I mean, even having written this book and knowing all this, my own lifestyle is, you know, I still am taking way more than my fair share, I would say. So it's a really hard thing.
Such a hard issue, and it goes to policies now about stopping fishing in certain areas of the waters because they're beyond regenerative at this point. And that
Mm-hmm.
goes for sansai, it goes for monoculture agriculture, it goes for so many things. I am so interested in how you are now working on a Japanese translation of this book. And when I read your book, Winifred, there are so many through your lens as an international person. You're taking in your interviews from Japanese that you did when you were traveling around Japan, taking in these stories and experiences. It goes through your lens as an international person with international experiences and cultures, and then writing the book. Now, what is happening with the process from that English, which has those lenses, to now
Yeah.
be changed into Japanese? How is the process going?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So the book is being translated by a man named, his pen name is Hayato Uesugi. He's a translator in Japan, quite experienced. He's translated, I don't know, something like 80 books. Um, and he's translating it for Aki Shobo is the publisher. They do a lot of translated nonfiction by some great authors. And thankfully they picked up this book and are publishing it. They hired him to translate it, and yeah, it's brought up so many like interesting questions for me, exactly like what you were talking about. I think one of the reasons probably that they were interested, the publisher was interested in translating it, and why Japanese readers may be initially drawn to it is because I have a foreign perspective on a very familiar topic, a very familiar part of Japanese culture. You know, everybody knows what SANSAI are. You know, very few people in the United States knew or know what it is. So I was taking advantage of that gap in the knowledge in the United States, where in Japan, the situation is completely different. Everybody has the basic knowledge. So I guess the question is, well, what does this foreigner, this American woman see? How does maybe she see something different? Or so that's a good thing in terms of selling books, but I guess I feel ambivalent because I feel like part of what I can offer is that foreign or outsider's perspective, but hopefully part of what I can offer is just about my perspective as a human being or an individual, that doesn't necessarily have to do with nationality, that has to do with my experiences throughout my life that brought me to the point of writing the book. So I'm hoping that it is, once people read it, they will view it as more than just a foreigner's look at SANSAI, if you know what I mean.
You've mentioned a few times that you are very interested in sansai and harvesting and foresting, foraging for foods, but you are most interested in people. So I think your stories and inferences about the people who do foraging, those will hopefully come through even in translation with a new perspective, because
Yeah.
it's not a field guide to finding your
Mm-hmm.
wild plants. It's much
Right.
more about the communities and the people that have
Mm-hmm.
done this throughout history, right?
Yes, and at my interest, exactly. I'm interested in the people, the characters I met, but also I'm interested in what is the meaning of sansai, of foraging. What does it mean for the culture and for the environment, for the land? Um, so I think some of those questions are very universal. Like, how does foraging or eating wild plants connect us to a place, or connect us to one another, or connect us to history and the past and our culture? Um, so I think, yes, I'm hoping that some of those themes will also, connect with the Japanese audience. Um, but yeah, it's been interesting. I was, to be honest, I was like terrified part of me is terrified to have a Japanese translation coming out because, yeah, it's going to be read by like who knows how many like total experts, people who have grown up with this culture and these foods and these practices. You know, I don't have the luxury anymore of writing for a novice audience. I'm writing for experts by virtue of being Japanese and, you know, living in Japan
But
on
I
Sans.
think I think Japanese people are so gracious and so appreciative of international people who have a deep respect and interest in things that they appreciate about their culture. And I think Sansai is one of them. I am sure you will get a lot of new fans who appreciate the fact that you have dove in to this quite difficult and complex subject about Japanese culture and history, right?
Well, I hope so. And fortunately, the translator, Hayata has put in a whole lot of work beyond translating in like fact checking everything, which I am very grateful for because, right, inevitably there are things that I misread or I wasn't able to do, you know, doing the research in Japanese, I wasn't able to have capture the breadth of resources or um, I just can't read as much in Japanese as I can in English, so I'm sure I missed things. And thankfully, as he was translating it, he went through and like checked up on everything. And yeah, I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also grateful that we had a really unusually collaborative translation process. Working as a translator myself, I know that in many cases, there's no interaction between the author and the translator. And there's just so much potential for misunderstanding, mistranslation, even no matter how careful you try to be, you know, you just can't get inside that person's head 100%. Fortunately, he reached out and he sent me lists of questions. You know, I would send him photographs of things, or I would send him my sources in Japanese, you know, um, and we had a quite a good exchange throughout the process of him translating the book. So I was fortunate in that way as well, that it
That
wasn't.
sounds great. That sounds like a really collaborative effort. Does this mean that now you have a professional fact checker, that you might have a new edition or a forward to the next edition of the English book as well? Like something updated that he was able to discover that you just couldn't do without an expert fact checker like him?
I
That would be
don't know if
fun.
we're ready for the second edition in
No,
English yet.
no, not
I'm
yet.
hoping that we find a larger audience in Japan because there's a built-in interest in the subject. Inevitably in English, it's a bit of a niche topic. Um, but one of the things he found out, um, you know, I think he was able, in one case, you know, when I'm writing about Iwate Prefecture and the history of famines there, and there was a local kind of record book that of weather and agricultural and famines and things like that going back hundreds of years that I describe at some length in the book. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I based it on like a secondary, basically account description of that book by someone who was involved in putting together a compilation of it. He, on the other hand, said, "Hey, we need to go to the original," which no way was I going to be able to do because this is like historic, you know, Japanese that is not used anymore, and that's beyond what I was able to do. He went to that source. So he was able to extract the real, you know, original quotes and stuff. So that's one situation where he, I think, really was able to add something
Wow,
to the
that's really
translation.
interesting. And that was
Yeah.
a lot of that was about Warabi, right?
Yeah, that was in the chapter about Wabi, and those records do mention its use here and there, but I use them more as kind of oh, you have that picture by Jeanette. That's beautiful. Yeah,
Beautiful,
Chappelle.
yeah.
Yeah, she's a an artist and a poet in Japan, and I asked her to make that painting for me because warabi are it's kind of such a symbolic and important plant in the book, and to me because of that. But anyhow, um, yeah, I used that record as more of kind of like just an illustration of how common famine and chronic hunger was in that part of Japan in the past, and how important wild foods were in getting people through
Yeah.
warabi roots and rhizomes, but also many other wild plants.
You often talk about the horse chestnuts culture
Mhm.
being part of the famine or anti-famine strategies, right? And that is always fascinating. We
Yeah,
have a comment from Dan with foraging in Japan. How would you compare it to other countries with edible safety, biodiversity, and people's reaction to it? Great question, Dan.
That's a huge question. I can speak a little bit to the United States, which is where I live and where I'm from. Um, the great thing about Japan, SANSAI in Japan, is that I feel like it's very much a living part of the culture with an unbroken connection to the past. So, you know, these traditions of using plants in certain places go back generations, and there are still people doing it. And it hasn't, that thread has not been broken. It doesn't have to be recreated, or it just has to be carried on, you know? Whereas in the United States, in a lot of places, partly because of the history, the colonial history we have, where the original inhabitants of a lot of places were uprooted and removed or killed, and new people came in, settlers, pioneers came in who were coming from a European culture or different, or African cultures, different parts of the world, having to acclimate and create new relationships with plants, and oftentimes having more agriculture based societies. So wild plants were less important or less valued. That it's much of like a more I feel like we have much more of a broken relationship with wild edible plants here, and many people are working really hard to repair it and reconnect. And a lot of native peoples and native communities have maintained their connections over time, but unfortunately, they are a minority in terms of our population, and a lot of people don't even know that those relationships exist or existed. So I would say that Japan is very fortunate in that way and should value that kind of living culture before it is lost.
That's a good answer. I was just reading today about how the government in Brazil, and this is like the opposite of protecting and appreciating foraging culture, your local plants and biodiversity assets, going the other extreme and going back on things that we kind of have learned from, and we're going the other direction again, like you said in America. We've learned that monocultures, raising all the trees and all the forests, and just doing cattle raising or monocultures is not a good idea. In Brazil, it seems like they're still going in that direction, unfortunately, which affects us all. But I'm so glad to hear that you're seeing, even on the grassroots level, that rising awareness that people are starting to appreciate it. And I do see that in Japan too. There is more awareness of the importance of natural farming, of even putting trees and plants together to raise crops. So, kind of moving away from the hugely damaging things that we've been doing too much of in the last 20 years or 50 years. Oh,
Yeah.
I really hope we're going in the right direction.
I mean, yes, I think it's happening on the fringes, and there's a lot to be hopeful about in Japan and the United States, and there's a lot to be still really concerned about because still the vast majority of the resources in our country are going towards, destructive agricultural practices and land use practices, and the trend really hasn't reversed. But at the same time, like you said, there are like signs of change. It's interesting. In recent weeks, I noticed that a couple of Robin Wall Kimmerer's books have been like on the top bestseller lists in the United States. And I remember I mentioned her last time we talked. She's a wonderful um, author, a Native woman. I believe she's Potawatomi tribe, and she is also a biologist. She studies moss and plants, and she's written a couple of great books about kind of blending science and kind of cultural other ways of relating to plants. One's called Gathering Moss, and one's called Braiding Sweetgrass. Anyway, I'm just so surprised that these are these books now um, about kind of reciprocal, how to create reciprocal relationships with plants based on kind of a different way of relating to the natural world. She draws on her native background and culture and kind of shares that with a broader audience. I'm just so happy and surprised that these books are now topping the bestseller lists. And I'm thinking, wow, maybe something is changing if that is happening.
Oh, I really hope so. I on many levels, people say during coronavirus they're starting to be more aware of their impact on the environment and how important it is to take care of our environment. I really hope that's true as we kind of get back to normal more. I don't know, since we have the vaccine, I hope people remember that feeling, but we're still having like supply chain issues, and I think that that is another reminder that we need to have local resources of our most important things to survive, and that is food. So I would hope that people start looking around where they live and think, if all the imports stop, how long can we survive? And maybe we should learn a little bit more about how to protect these things that we need for survival, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also think, I mean, that's one reason why a local food economy is important, um, using, right, both agricultural and forage foods. And another reason that I've thought about a lot is that I think our human capacity for caring and for knowing and understanding has limits. And we have to recognize that and match the way we are consuming and what the areas that we're impacting with that scope of caring. For example, it's very easy to care about environmental harm happening in your own community. It's quite hard in a sustained way to care about environmental harm happening in a random community in Mongolia or Brazil or wherever it is. So I think that's a big problem with the way our food system and our supply chains now are set up, is that we're having a much greater impact than we're capable of understanding or really truly caring about. So I think that refocusing on um, a local food system, it kind of reins in reins that in a little bit so that we're our impacts are more in scale with what we can handle, what we can actually take care of.
I agree. Yeah, I think Japan is at 60% dependent on imports for food. as long as we can spread that awareness. I don't think a lot of people know that. I grew up in Hawaii, where we're 90%
Oh wow. Yeah.
dependent on imports of food.
Mhm.
So we need to at least know the situation where we live, and
Yeah.
hopefully make better decisions because of it, because it affects us. Like you said, it's much easier to care about what's happening in your backyard, right?
Right, right. And to be responsible, to live in a more responsible way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think foraging is a good way to start connecting with that, just it doesn't have to be your entire diet. It's not going to be. But even just foraging, learning how to forage some wild plants here and there now and then, um, really will start to connect people, or it has at least for me, more deeply with the place that they live, with the seasons in the place that they live. And it doesn't have to be hard. It can be like quite enjoyable and simple. Just to start out with a couple plants that appeal to you, and start incorporating them into your diet and your lifestyle.
Yeah. You mentioned this in your book about how you saw a development of the landscape because of the kinds of foods that people needed. So, for example, the horse chestnuts, you saw more of the horse chestnuts around different areas of Japan because that was a very popular survival food, that kind of thing. Do you think people will start to do that more, like planting bamboo with the idea of harvesting it? So it's kind of like intentional sansai. Did you come across that in your book at all in modern times?
Um, let's see. Well, it's hard to say, but I can say that the concept of like tending the wild, which I should attribute to somebody, Sam Thayer talks about. He's a great author of wild food books here, and actually here in Wisconsin. Um, Talks about right now. What can we do right now? We can start whatever little bit of land you own or you have access to, start selectively, kind of just gently nudging it towards, um, you know, a kind of landscape that would be productive and beneficial for you as well as for the wildlife. So, for example, if you see an elderberry plant, clear it, and an elderberry is a very medicinal, great plant to nurture and to have on your land. So if you see one of those start to grow, you just clear the plants around it a little. Just give it a little extra help to encourage that in the landscape. Um, so I think that people are maybe starting to have that idea again of how to positively shape um, the land towards these species that are beneficial to people.
Yeah. I hear that. I went to a Minka summit this year in May, the very first of its kind, where everybody gathered who is interested in taking over these old houses in rural Japan areas. And people often talk about not only repairing the houses, but gardening and tending the forested areas around. And there's a lot of talk about planting fruit trees,
Yeah.
planting trees that bear food, or trees or bushes
Mhm.
at different times of the year. And this is something that you often talk about, right? The seasonality, the diversity of having access to
Yeah.
the foraging foods. It's
Yeah.
very clever, very smart.
Yeah, yeah. But another thing, I guess, just to highlight about what I was just saying a second ago is, and it's great to plant trees, to make orchards, to plant food forests. But one thing that Sam Thayer points out as well is oftentimes, a plant that is growing in that spot of its own accord, that came up there for some reason, will thrive and do much better than a plant that you plant there randomly. um, you know, that plant chose that place to come up. So if we can also start thinking about how can we find what is useful already in the natural landscape and encourage it beyond just planting things and kind of like transforming the landscape, but rather observing and nurturing what we like that was already there. I think that's a really valuable perspective to add as well.
Yeah, that's really important. You don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? You can see what assets you already have, and just try to nurture that a bit as well. There was a guy in Wakayama, a Singaporean entrepreneur, Lee Shanji, who is harvesting tea from 100-year-old tea bushes, which he's finding in the forest around his area. So
Mm,
that's kind of the same idea, right? He's starting to
yeah,
take care of those old plants, which
yeah,
are there. Nobody has even noticed them for a long
mhm,
time. But you
yeah,
have to come in with some kind of idea of what to look for. And that's
yeah.
another way that your book can help, right?
Well, as a starting point, I think I hope that nobody will use my book to actually identify plants and eat them because it does not contain enough information, botanical information to do that. But it can give you an idea of what kinds of plants grow in which areas that are common that you might be able to then learn more about and go out and find for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. You want a good field guide, which has very specific information about the plants. Last time we talked, you were talking about some very look-alike toxic
Yeah.
plants that are not the edible kind. So you really want to make sure you're picking what you want to pick and not poisoning yourself and your family,
Yes.
right?
Yes, I should make my disclaimer. Plants can kill you. Please be careful when you're out in the woods. Don't just pick something and put it in your mouth. You got to know what you're doing. Find a
Yeah,
mentor, or at the very least, do some really good, solid studying up before you start eating things from
yeah.
the wild. Yes.
Yes, definitely. Luckily, we have Google and we have a lot of apps that help you identify plants these days. Get it from a variety of sources. But I love all of your stories about people and community and heritage and history of the foraging aspects of Japanese culture. Thank you so much, Winifred. A wonderful conversation. Great to catch up after a year.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back on the show. It's been great to talk.
Oh, good. I would love to catch up once the Japanese book comes out. It would be great to hear how your reaction from your Japanese readers are and what kind
Yeah.
of questions they ask. Wouldn't that be exciting?
Yeah, let's hope for the best.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. Thank you so much, Winifred. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Tomorrow, actually, we have another interesting talk, kind of related. We're talking with Hannah Lewis. She wrote an interesting book called Mini Forest Revolution using the Miyawaki method to rapidly rewild the world. So she talks about
Awesome.
Miyawaki's method. Very small spaces can be changed into diverse forests. So it'll be really interesting conversation with her tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Take care. Thanks. Thanks, Winifred.